Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this Innovation Forum webinar. I'm Ian Welsh and I'll be your host today. Over the next hour or so, we will be asking what's next for the Global Plastics Treaty following the most recent round of talks in Canada, which just wrapped up. And we have a great expert panel to help frame our discussion. We have Erin Smith from WWF and Jodie Roussel from Nestle, both hot foot from the discussions in Canada. We have Patrick Sewell from Mondelez International, Anthony Tusino from the Recycling Partnership. I'll be turning to our panel shortly, but we do want to hear from you all too. Please put your questions or comments to us using the Q&A function. When doing so, please put your name and organization, and if you can keep your interventions short, they are more likely to be brought into our discussion. Now, in our initial panel discussions, we will assume a reasonably high level of pre-knowledge, but if there are any areas where some additional background would be useful for you, please just let us know, and we will come to them in the Q&A. Okay, turning to the panel. Erin, why don't you reflect on the negotiations in Canada? Give us some reasons for optimism and a bit about where we go from here. Erin.
Thank you. So I think we came into these negotiations with a lot on the line. We had not made as much progress in the previous sessions, and we had not made a mandate for intersessional work between INC-3 and 4. And so I think everybody came in thinking this is the one where we have to get a lot done. This is really make or break. And what was really helped build up some confidence in the beginning was that there was that same normal ambitious energy that rolled in with a lot of great events, a great partnership day. And you could just tell from the beginning that member states had a different energy to them, a more collaborative energy. And so that was really good. That's the sense you need coming into it. And you could tell that they had done some informal intersessional work and more bilaterals on things. And even throughout the week, we saw them acting in good faith to the process, which means they were negotiating and trying. That doesn't mean there was not delay tactics at play, but we saw the chair and member states sort of get them a bit more under control. So that political will that we were so desperate for previously sort of showed up. And what was really good was we saw an alignment on inclusion into the instrument, things like problematic products and chemicals of concern, submissions for text and discussion. Really what's still to be decided is whether those things will be mandated at the global level or whether they will be determined by national standards. And so we'll see how that plays out, but the majority of countries still want that to be a global rule. We also saw this same situation for design guidelines, the need for those to be included, and a majority hoping for them to be at the global level. We had a lot of great discussions on EPR, both informal and in the contact groups. I see that as playing out as an important aspect of the treaty. I participated in some really productive conversations with countries about how to make it as consistent as possible, but with flexibility. That's going to be important everywhere, right? There are countries that are starting from zero. There are states in the United States that are starting from zero. And so we want that consistency within there around how the methodologies to design the eco-modulation, the way these things are structured, but we want to help them to make that stepwise change. And of course, another key element for implementation is going to be around the financial mechanism. Some really interesting and creative options put on the table in regards to that. So that was all good. I don't want to say that we made this like amazing progress. It was like moving from no movement to moving like at the speed of a turtle, right? Like, so it wasn't, comparatively, we weren't like, woo, but we made progress, and it's super important to acknowledge that. In the final days is when we started to see how decisions made this week would impact the rest of the process. One, the chair put forward a proposal on intersessional work. We were really pleased to see broad alignment around that. In the wee hours of Tuesday morning, the final decisions around whether it would be included and what would be in it were one final debate that was had. And I think many of us are happy that we're having it because that's super important. But there is this worry that primary polymer production is not included in it. And I think that's a worry because of a couple of reasons. One, if it's not included in intersessional work, a lot of these countries don't feel like they've had adequate time to discuss, debate, and learn so that they can negotiate in the fall. And so if it doesn't have that discussion and that rich period, there's a lower likelihood of it ending up in an instrument. And I don't think that means that this treaty will fail, but if we talk about the different levers to get to reduced amount of raw material, that's the easiest way, right? That's like the direct shot. If you reduce how much you make and then create demand signals to reduce more and further, it's easier. So now these countries are going to have to depend pretty primarily on demand signals. And so the rigor of those is going to depend on how successful they are. I think the other thing that I think is worrisome and is a sort of a sleeper worry for me is that the text got locked between now and INC-5. And while we really started early reducing brackets, which is points of contention in the week, we have really added a lot back in. And those things all need to be resolved. So there's a lot of work in front of those member states. So I still believe that we have the opportunity to deliver a solid treaty. It is going to be fully dependent on how hard these countries work to make that happen.
So thanks, Erin. So what's the reasoning behind not including primary polymer production?
Oh, and that's a complicated one. I think it comes down to a couple things. I think it comes down to a number of countries who do not want production affected by this mechanism at all. And those countries were very vocal, not very vocal in the way that you would see it in the process, but they basically wouldn't have supported intersessional work if it was a part of it. So your choice was have intersessional work and it was necessary, right? We have a ton of work to do. So I think in the end, there was a lot of deals made behind the scenes. And that was the price we paid. And it's interesting. I had this conversation with my daughter this morning about that. She's like, but it's such an important piece. And I was like, yes, but also having intersessional work is important because there's so many other things. So it's like you're making a choice between two not perfect choices always in this process. And so it can be interesting as an observer to watch it and want more sort of yes, no, but you're like, oh, okay. But I think in the end, that's the art of compromise. Everybody walks away kind of like, hey, yeah. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Well, thank you. It sounds like it's a classic example of everyone having to be consciously not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah, I think so.
Erin, thanks very much. Lots to come back on there. Jody, what were your impressions of being at the negotiations, and what other things did you take away?
In some of the major takeaways, I think that where we started with the original Nairobi resolution that was voted on by the environment ministers back 2 years ago, the text in different countries, varying interpretations of that text have set us up for where we are today. So some countries assumed that there would be reductions in primary polymer production. Other countries assumed that that would never be on the table, and that this treaty would be looking at better product design in the midstream and EPR waste management topics at end of life, as well as support for economies that don't have developed collection, sorting, reuse, or recycling systems. And so for me, that's one of the main contextual challenges when we look at how are we going to move forward. And one of the ambassadors had said in the wee hours of the morning on Tuesday that everyone's unhappy with where we are. So maybe we can accept that we're equally unhappy, and that's something we can agree on in order to accept the chair's proposal for intersessional work to move forward. It was a really pragmatic statement, and I think one that reflected the nature of the diplomatic conundrum that the UN member states found themselves in. Because no matter what, the treaty is serving as an accelerator for action that's taking place at the national and the regional scale. And admittedly, we made a lot of progress. I sat in one contact group that went from 17 different options for unique clauses down to 3. That was progress. And to get so many countries to agree to move from 17 to 3 options gets us a lot closer to the draft that we had 6 months ago. with restrictions and phase outs, with product design, with extended producer responsibility, waste management, and also all the discussions around what financial resources might be made available and how can governments also avail of existing financial resources that already exist in capital markets. Those were really important conversations that we had. And I think that we'd be in a different place if we looked back with a crystal ball and we said, oh, well, if we'd only had intercessional work after Paris and after Nairobi, which many had pushed for, but the group collectively wasn't ready to say yes because there were too many unresolved details. So the informal intercessional work that happened in March this year and early April, I think really helped the group move forward on a number of issues, particularly on restrictions, on phase out, on design issues. But there's a tremendous amount of work to do moving ahead. The chair had proposed a mode of intercessional work, which was accepted, which will be a mix of online work to allow collaboration to start earlier, and also some in person. And I think we're still waiting to find out where will be those locations and who may provide financing to bring delegates. There's also a question around what level of participation by expert observers may be welcome and accepted. And so all of that needs to be resolved in the coming weeks. But overall, we're at least moving. And some governments are moving in very different ways. I mean, we saw the G7 announcement on primary polymer reductions that was made the last day we were there, and the Bridge to Busan statement has been posted online, which is a group of member states that are continuing to focus on primary polymer reductions. But the challenge will be if this is going to be an agreement that is decided by consensus, not everything will stay on the table. And that may be very disappointing to many observers, many organizations, or individuals who are looking to have an all-encompassing tool. But in the end, the treaty has to provide a high-level structure that can last for decades and some flexible annexes that can evolve over time from COP to COP to help us address the challenge in front of us.
Okay, so is there a possibility then of primary polymer production coming back into the treaty?
I think right now it's off the table for intercessional work. And I think if the treaty is going to be decided by consensus, it doesn't seem very probable. But there are a large number of countries. I mean, the last time I looked, it was 30, and then there'd been the announcement in the closing statements the European Union would be joining. So it's just a question of how many member states support that. Remember, the treaty is designed to harmonize legislation between governments and resolve issues they can't resolve alone. That doesn't mean that other governments may not choose to take other actions that they liked in the treaty conversation that weren't moved forward. And that may not be limited just to the issue of primary polymers.
It's interesting, isn't it? That, I mean, if you asked, took a straw poll of people in the street, and you said to them, oh, there's a global plastics treaty, they will assume that the number one thing that would be on that would be reduction of primary polymers.
And, we've seen surveys. There's the WWF survey, the National Resources Defense Council survey, the Greenpeace survey, the Oceana survey. I mean, the public has spoken about their preferences, but those preferences may or may not be expressed in the actual text of the treaty.
Great, thanks, Jodie. Again, lots to come back on. Well, audience, I can guarantee right now, if you ask a question, it will get asked, as currently we don't have any. So please do be thinking about your questions and putting them to our panel. As I said earlier, if there's some background you want us to go into, then do let us know. So anything, all questions are on the table during this webinar. Okay, Patrick, let me turn to you. What do you think the future then is going to look like? Building on what we've heard from Erin and Jodie, what do you think future looks like? And if you have any thoughts as to what a final resolution needs to look like in terms of ambition, that'd be really interesting. Patrick.
Yeah, and I'm not a savant, so I'm going to get this all wrong, but I can certainly give you a perspective on what I hope the final treaty looks like. I think the umbrella theme that I'm going to talk under is a start and strengthen approach. And Jodie referred to this as well, because there's this pragmatism that we all have to accept, right? You can be really Pollyannish, you can aim for the perfect instrument that drives an end to plastics pollution by 2040 per the original mandate set out at INC-4, which is the summit of the environmental ministers in Kenya that Jodie also referred to. But I think understanding the diverse political landscape, national interest, etc., we need to find areas of consensus. We need to build strength there. and then we work through COP to continue to strengthen over time, as I think some of those points of tension continue to get worked through. I think in summary, I totally agree with everything that Erin and Jodie said. And I think for me, it's uniquely valuable. And I hope everybody on this webinar agrees to actually hear two people, boots on the ground, that were part of these negotiations. What did they experience? What did they hear? And it's great that both Erin and Jodie see reasons to be positive, because coming out of INC-3, I think you would have heard a much more pessimistic point of view. But I think, there's clearly one reason to be optimistic, which is a commitment to conduct intersessional formal work. It's unprecedented. This is really critical to driving consensus around areas where we agree that that we want to focus and we want to further strengthen the legal language within the treaty. And there's reasons to be pessimistic. I think what we're all really pushing for is a legally binding global instrument that sets common global rules, instead of pushing this down to individual countries and relying on national efforts, because that's what is driving a lot of the issues that we struggle with as players along the plastics value chain today, as you have this disconnected patchwork of different mandatory and voluntary schemes. It's not effective in terms of really driving the systems change at a global level that we require in order to end plastics pollution. So that's worrying. I mean, we really want something that's mandatory in nature and does start to standardize global rules. So hopefully that is something through intersessional work and at INC-5 in Busan, we'll see critical breakthrough there. And I think kind of, again, focusing around areas where there's consensus commitment to getting this done is probably how we get to success in that regard. Moving forward, I think what's critical is that we continue to work with the same sense of passion and urgency. And it's great, Jodie and Erin, to hear that there was a lot of positive energy on the ground in Ottawa, that people weren't showing pessimism, depression, signs of anxiety, and still working with that same sense of urgency. But we need to work across multiple stakeholder groups and work with the intent to negotiate and ratify a treaty that really meets the mandate set out in UNEA 5 and actually addresses the full life cycle of plastics, from production through design to downstream waste management. If we only tackle part of that value chain, part of that full life cycle of plastics, it's going to be very, very difficult to meet our end ambition, which is to end plastics pollution by 2040. And I would imagine everybody's joined this call because they principally agree that that's the aspiration that we need to set, that this is a worrying problem, has potential impacts for both people and planet, and this is something we can no longer tolerate, and we have to find effective mechanisms to resolve it. When I think about what the treaty should contain moving forward, I'm going to talk to our collective views within the business coalition. So convened by WWF and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, 220 plus businesses, financial institutions, representing different stages within the plastics value chain. We've been very specific in the positions that we put forward. We share these views as businesses. We consolidate our positions as a way of really amplifying the voice of progressive businesses. So what we're hoping that the final treaty includes is, A, it covers the full plastics life cycle from production design to disposal, and sets global rules that cover reduction of plastics. So that's where we talk about, primary polymers of production and really looking at how do we make sure that we are slowly turning off the tap, right? Because if we continue to produce more and more and more, then we're just going to see an exacerbation of the issue. So we need to look at mechanisms to transition away from unrelenting production to some form of regulation that limits production, but also working through circulation of those materials, those plastic products that continue to be placed on the market, and then prevention of leakage into nature and remediation of any social or planetary harms done to date. So if I quickly expand in, and then I'll stop because I don't want to consume all the time, and Anthony's got some really interesting perspectives to share as well, is, we need a treaty that ultimately aims to reduce the use of virgin plastic, prioritizes the elimination of problematic plastic applications, and ensures that chemicals and polymers of concern are not placed on the market. So anything that has potential high toxicity for human health or for planetary health, right? We need to make sure that those chemicals and polymers are clearly called out, and we start to mandate restrictions and ultimately eliminate the use of those materials and placing those on the market. And then for any materials that are on the market today, how do we make sure that those are circulated? So common EPR policies, right, and extended producer responsibility is where producers that place plastic products on the market, they are responsible for the end of life management of those plastics when they become waste. So you pay a fee, and what that fee should be used for is to then invest in the infrastructure required to collect, sort, and recycle that material, so then you can extend it through a circular economy over kind of its fullest potential life cycle at highest economic value. And finally, what we need to make sure that we have is effective regulatory and financial incentives to promote the uptake of a circular economy, and also drives that kind of just and fair transition. Because as with climate change, right, it's those countries that are developing countries that typically don't have the economic strength to be able to build these systems that are going to be worst hit by plastics pollution. So it's really important that those financial mechanisms are blended, but also that they assist countries with the biggest distance to travel and maybe the lack of existing funding to be able to finance system development, that we're really ensuring that this is effective globally and supports all member states, and not just those that are cash rich and have deeper pockets.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. And thank you also to audience for your questions. One thing I should have mentioned is you can upvote questions. So if you like a particular question, you want to see it answered, you can click the thumbs up symbol, and then I will use the votes, the questions that have got the most votes. And thanks also to those of you who've added your name. Always prefer to add your name if you can, please, rather than anonymous. However, anonymous attendee, we will get to your questions as well, I hope. Okay, Anthony, thanks very much for your patience. What can you perhaps build on the conversation and reflect a little bit in terms of what this all looks like from a policy perspective, Anthony?
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and thanks to the panelists really for teeing this up so well. I can speak from a U.S. perspective. The Recycling Partnership is a U.S.-based, mission-driven organization that advocates for a better and more equitable circular economy. But I leave Ottawa feeling encouraged, and I leave feeling encouraged for two reasons. I think there's a real recognition that the components of the treaty are meant to work with each other. When we talk about extended producer responsibility, it has reduction and reuse-based outcomes. It's not just focused on producers paying a fee. When we talk about design standardization, it helps create a better system so materials don't end up in nature where they don't belong. When we talk about primary polymers or polymers of concern, those have positive impacts on human health and our recycling system. So we leave Ottawa recognizing that while these can feel like segmented conversations in contact groups or among like-minded folks, they really create common outcomes at the end to create a more circular economy. And I want to say, sort of ease the burden of compliance. If we have good standardized design, if we have good extended producer responsibility, if we have comprehensive mechanisms for evaluating the safety of chemicals, they all work together to create a system where businesses and governments can create a more unified and uniform approach to compliance. So that leaves me feeling really encouraged. And I think on the policy level, we're seeing from governments, from businesses, and from fellow NGOs that all of those components need to work together in our advocacy. We can't talk about one without talking about the other, and that will create, at the end of the day, a more effective treaty. I think what we're also seeing is sort of unique to our time in the policy landscape, where businesses, as Jody and Deb and Erin and Patrick have mentioned, businesses are calling for accountability, and that creates sort of a unique political aspect here in the United States, as I'm sure it does in other countries. We have much greater chances of success and implementation when we can come together as a stakeholder community and find alignment and find common ground. Now, I don't say this to say that the treaty should be consensus-based or should be lowest common denominator, but when we can find those ways in which we can work together to achieve outcomes that produce positive results for businesses, for local communities, and for our environment, we create a much stronger argument. And we're seeing that here across the United States. We're approaching sort of a similar microcosm of the international landscape, where 4 states have passed extended producer responsibility. We might have a 5th very soon. I don't want to jinx it. But we're seeing that compliance is really hard. And this is really mimicking what's happening on the international stage for the business community. So we're seeing really positive results of that common language, but also common understanding that this is not something we can do alone. This is not something we can do state by state. This is not something we can do country by country. So a real coming together on an alignment of values is really changing the political landscape. From my perspective, extended producer responsibility at the national level is really important to implementing those obligations when you can build in those outcome-based approaches to reduction, reuse, better recycling, better recapture, and better recognition of the impacts on local communities. And I'm encouraged. I work in politics. I know we all work in politics to a certain extent, and it can get kind of depressing when you look at the actual pace of how long votes take and how long we need to educate. But I think the momentum is really there coming out of INC-4 on the international level, and that's trickling down to the national level here in the United States.
Thank you very much indeed. Really useful. And thank you very much to to the audience for all questions that are coming in. I'm going to turn to them now. Just very quickly, Jodie's been very vociferously and quickly answering all the questions. I just want to just go through a couple of those just so everyone can share. We had a question around the idea of how many countries will need to ratify the convention for it to come into force. As Jodie points out, the answer is 50 is the usual number they have to ratify before one of these can come into force. We also had a question about in reflecting if primary production direct reductions are likely off the table for now, is more focus being put onto the problematic additives or on demand side controls as well, as was mentioned. And Jodie says that all other levers are still on the table. And discussion on bioplastics. That's actually really interesting. Jodie, and then Erin, what were the discussions around bioplastics? As Jodie points out in her response, still lots of contention for sure. Jodie.
So a number of member states have proposed a discussion on plastic alternatives and alternative materials. I think this, if I link it to the trade question as well, this links to discussions that are happening in the WTO context in the dialogue on plastic pollution that 85 member states are part of, representing about 85% of trade in plastics today. I think where we are now, the treaty right now, I mean, the negotiators are struggling to get to a treaty text that's high level enough it can last for decades, broad enough, but at the same time has specific legally binding rules. And the challenge is we have very little time left to conclude text negotiations. So I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with something that refers to other alternatives to plastic, as opposed to, let's say, a specific discussion on bioplastics with a specific target. I think that second scenario is highly unlikely, but in the magical world of diplomatic affairs, there's always the opportunity to use broader language to give space to other options and to include them in the scope.
Erin, did you want to comment further?
I was going to comment on, there's a bunch of procedural stuff on intersessional work and voting, and I thought I would add some color to all of those questions if that would be helpful.
Sure.
So a couple questions were on what is intersessional work, formal intersessional work, what is it going to be covering, and then how are we going to make decisions ultimately? So formal intersessional work is work that is agreed upon by the committee. So the committee is made up of the countries who are the member states. And when it is formal, it means that the output and the process itself is accepted by all to inform the next part of the process. That's really great because the informal stuff is progress, but it is not adopted as much by everybody because it's only adopted by those who did the work. So this, having it formal is important because it's like, we all agree these are important enough topics. The reason intersessional work is so important, and the reason why we worry about the lack of primary polymer production not being in there, is because all of the topics on the table are quite technical. Sort of building off what Jodie was just mentioning, like in many cases, they're trying to go as high level as possible because you could go down super deep rabbit holes on every one of these technical topics, right? And so they want to create sort of framing that guides all of it. But the ones that they are choosing to debate means that they will be able to make decisions in Busan. Because if they do not have a conversation on it, if they don't go in deep, if they don't learn a bit more, a lot of these delegations don't have that background and expertise, and they don't feel comfortable committing to what that text says. So they are, it's really important that they have these sort of experts who we don't know who they are yet, helping to inform that process. So in this intersessional work, they are covering criteria and non-criteria based ways of assessing problematic materials and chemicals. That non-criteria based was an addition as a part of the negotiations, which is kind of concerning, but alas, it is there. They're also going to discuss modes of implementation. So that's MOI. That's going to be like the financial instrument. It'll probably cover EPR. It'll probably cover waste management, those things that will be, need to be discussed. So that's what's going to be, having conversation. Now, if we wanted to be super optimistic, we could say that countries would still continue to push for primary polymer production in informal work, enough where they socialized it to still put it on the table. The reason I'm not as optimistic as that is that there are countries that are solidly against it, as Jody mentioned, just will not even consider it. And so they will probably come to Busan and say, well, we did not have this a part of intersessional work, so we cannot debate it. And it is fascinating to watch that stop the process. So that's where we're at on intersessional work. The second piece was about, how are we going to make decisions? So we have provisionally applied the rules of procedure to this, and every session we open up and we agree to provisionally apply them. In those provisionally applied rules of procedure, everything is to be decided by consensus. However, if a consensus cannot be found, the committee can vote. The threat of a vote is what they talk about. Now, it is still there in the provisionally applied rules of procedure. Now, every session gets opened up, usually with India saying, Chair, I want you to guarantee to us that we will make all decisions this week by consensus. And the chair will respond back with something sort of blurry, because in the end, the chair has no authority to state this. It is the committee members who make this decision. He will say something like, we will do our best to make all decisions by consensus.
We're there with what the thank you, India, for your intervention.
But thank you for your intervention, India. We appreciate you. Don't let us forget. So that's interesting, right? And this is like one of these wonky things where in the negotiations, perception and attitude about something can almost become reality, right? So everybody came into this optimistic, and there was a lot of optimism because we all said we could do it, right? But if we all came into it really negative, then it probably wouldn't have progressed. And with the vote thing, the threat of a vote still exists. Member states believe that and know that. So they are still working to compromise. If they weren't working to compromise, you would think they truly believed that consensus was the only way. Because with consensus, at the end of the day, one of them can just be like, no, and then it falls apart, right? It gives the power of one individual country the ability to blow it all up. So when we think about the final decision on this, right, will it be decided by consensus or vote? There is the assumption that we will get to a point in this process that a vote will happen, whether it is around the final decision of accepting the treaty text or something before then. And that is when we will see the battle ensue that we started in Paris, when they concluded that they still didn't like the idea that there could be a vote. And then they agreed to remember that. And so by remembering that, it will just start all over again. Our opinion is that you don't start that conversation until something's on the line. You don't start that conversation until it's important to vote. And that's when the political will, because ultimately to decide not to vote needs to be voted on. And that is the irony of it all.
When you do come to, or if come to a vote, what's the process? Is it qualified majority voting goes through, or is it a majority of one?
I think it's 2/3. Am I right on that, Jody? 2/3 of a quorum?
I think you're also right on 2/3, but I would want to double check with one of the treaty lawyers.
Yes,
But
what she said.
I mean, if we look at where countries are, in terms of the level of support. We regularly have between 110 to 145 countries, all
Yeah.
calling for a legally binding treaty, all calling for action on primary polymer production, plus
Yeah.
product design, EPR, waste management, restrictions and phase outs, and chemicals of concern. There's actually a huge amount of consensus. And many of the speakers, let's say for the small island developing states or the AOSIS group, they have a lot of moral high ground. Their countries are currently threatened, their existence is threatened by climate change and sea level rise. They have large amounts of plastic waste washing up on their shores brought by the tides. I mean, they have really existential challenges, and their reality deserves to be recognized. And we all have an imperative to work on this issue. It's not only those countries, but some of them are threatened more than others. And it's a real challenge in a multilateral process to continue to push for consensus when some countries are clearly have negotiating positions that are against any interpretation of the framing of the Nairobi resolution.
I think Jody makes a good point on the majority. At the end of the day, the few that are choosing to push back on decision making are just the few that don't agree on these things. And so it's a true threat for them to vote.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be really optimistic. I mean, just piggybacking on what Erin and Jody said, I mean, there is strong consensus. What you're seeing is national politics play out, and there's national interests that compete against some of the key areas of policy that we want the treaty to address. But I think there's still reason to be very positive going into INC-5 that consensus can be found. I guess it's just consensus on what, and then how does that ultimately lead into the formal text that will be ratified.
Thank you. Anthony, I just want to turn to you. Question around the approach of the US. Our Felix Dodds points out that the US has only ratified one legally binding convention protocol since the United Nations Framework on Climate Change Framework Convention in 1994, 30 years ago. So how is the US approaching the negotiations, Anthony?
Yeah, I think the US is in a bit of a tough spot. We don't have any national laws that mandate waste management or recycling or a circular economy the way other nations do. We don't have national targets. We have over 20,000 municipal waste management systems that all face varying levels of capacity and complexity. So the national government showing up on an international stage is in a bit of a tough position. I think they want to be ambitious. I think they know that this is a once in a lifetime moment to make real change. But their negotiating position is one that focuses on the national action type commitment. I think, though, this is where I'm really encouraged by how the US stakeholders are showing up on the international stage. We see American businesses, from producers through major brands like those represented here, through local governments, showing up and saying, we need to advocate for a national extended producer responsibility system that will meet the demands of a treaty. So I think the way that the US shows up on the international stage is a bit complicated, but I'm also encouraged that we're using this opportunity to push for more and to know that even if the United States doesn't ratify a treaty immediately after the diplomatic conference in early 2025, which is no surprise here, not the norm of the United States, there is a real opportunity to continue to implement and meet the demands of the treaty the same way we did after the US withdrew from Paris. We saw a big movement from the national business community to meet the obligations of the Paris Agreement, even if the United States was not an official signatory. I think we're going to see a lot of that here after negotiations wrap up and after the diplomatic conference, a real push for national action to meet those demands and obligations of the treaty. I think that comes back also to US communities and US business communities being a leader on the international stage. They know we can't continue to advocate on the international stage for something that we're not doing in every nation, regardless of if they're a party to the treaty or not. So the US government takes an interesting position, but I think the US stakeholder community is much more aligned and much more ready to.
Thank you. Perhaps question to the others then. I mean, what countries do you see as really being the leaders here? Patrick?
I mean, you have two groups of countries, right? Those that are maybe looking for less progressive policy, and think of like the OPEC countries, right? Who economically rely on polymer production and production of fossil fuels on an extractive economy basis, right? And so they're much less ambitious. And then the high ambition countries, so think EU, you know, the Scandi countries in particular, that are really pushing for much more progressive and ambitious policy and a legally binding treaty that meets the initial mandate. And those countries are also benefiting from having proven out that you can be successful in addressing plastics pollution, because they already have national or voluntary mechanisms in place that are kind of giving them the data points to feel really bullish that actually this is a solvable problem, but they understand the systems change that's required behind it. So, you know, paraphrased as the hack countries, and Erin and Jody, keep me honest here, I think it's about 70, 80 plus countries that we see are really pushing for very, very progressive policy. But yeah, like I say, it's those economies that rely on extractive businesses that are maybe the force that are slightly pulling us back in terms of the progressive language that they want to see in the final treaty text.
Thank you. And Erin, here's a chance for you to highlight some companies you think are doing a good job in this.
I think, you know, what has been super impressive and honestly really effective in this process has been the Business Coalition. So the Business Coalition is made up of over 200 companies globally, and we've seen their presence and their advocacy for ambition really affect the process in a really good way. I think early on, we heard from the Secretariat and such that this was a game changer, and we've heard from countries how it has helped them to think more ambitiously because they know they aren't going to have to do it on their own, but they can do it in partnership with these companies who have been at this for a while and know what is needed and are willing to sort of take the steps, but they need to be met in that private-public partnership of what this is building, right? I think the treaty and the national implementation, what that's going to look like for every country, is going to be public-private partnership at its best. Because it does need to come from everybody. It's not just going to be the policies in the treaty. It's going to be the efforts made by companies in parallel to that. A lot of in many cases, we hope that the treaty will be a forcing function to level the playing field a bit, because it can't just be the ones, it just can't be those 200. It has to be others too. It has to be everybody. And so I think that we've been really pleased with how that has helped to maintain sort of a higher level of discussion. You know, at this point, we've only got one session left, and you normally see sort of the range where you're negotiating can be, you've got the far more ambitious, you've got the less ambitious, and usually what happens is you start negotiating here in the middle. But because of all of this, the negotiating space is over here. And it will still come this way, but it won't start here and come this way, if that makes sense. So it does allow us to negotiate in a space of more ambition and come to consensus there. So yeah, it's been really, I would say, very valuable to have these businesses advocating. And I would say to what Anthony has been sharing with the US, these companies are advocating for domestic policy too, because they know how important it is for the US to be able to move domestically in order to be as successful. You know, they want to help the US deliver on what they're trying to do in their unique way by progressing national policy and federal policy. So it is a game changer.
Thank you. Nice swerve of actually naming some companies, Erin. But let's move to another question. Very good question, and this comes to the heart really of the packaging, sustainable packaging debate. And Matthias asks, is there a risk that the treaty will actually foster substitution to other materials, for example, paper or cardboard, which in themselves may be less sustainable than plastics that they replace? What is the danger of that? Patrick?
It's a great question, because we do have to be mindful that we make decisions really understanding the full life cycle implications of those decisions. So it's easy to be super binary or arbitrary and say, okay, well, paper's better than plastic. And look, in some cases that will absolutely be true, but what's really that companies think very holistically around the full life cycle and implications of those transitions. So again, if you move to paper, does it contain high levels of plastic as a coating, as a moisture barrier, as a protective layer for the product inside? And therefore, maybe it can't be recycled through traditional paper pulping infrastructure. It could lead to higher rates of deforestation, which we know is a critical driver of the climate catastrophe that we're all, as businesses on this call and as organizations on this call, mindful of looking to address. And Nestle and Mondelez are working on kind of a pathway to being net zero businesses. So it's really important that we don't make decisions in a vacuum that then lead to unintended consequences. And those consequences we think about are, is it driving higher rates of GHG emissions? If so, we shouldn't do it. Or is it likely going to exacerbate the waste problem? And then we shouldn't do it. So, unfortunately, my job most of the time is I take very simple ideas or concepts that the business puts in front of me around how we could make our packaging more sustainable. And then I make it really complicated because I talk about all of the systems-wide implications of those decisions. So it's a really important question. I don't think the treaty risks exacerbating the shift to alternative materials that further advance the plastics pollution problem, because I do think a lot of businesses are working with that full holistic view and making really mindful decisions, because they're not just looking to tackle plastics pollution, they're looking to do that alongside ensuring that we protect human rights, right? Pay a fair living wage under our social sustainability umbrella. We all have climate agendas. We all have ingredients and deforestation-free agendas as well. So as long as companies are looking across the full suite of what's needed to drive social and environmental progress, I think there's a very limited danger that you're just going to see this mass transition to more harmful materials that maybe exacerbate other critical issues like deforestation. But it's a really fantastic question, and we should continue to flag this as a risk and really force companies to make really mindful decisions that benefit both people and the planet.
Anthony, do you want to comment on that as well? The risk of moving to what in the face of it might be better material, but in fact is worse. I mean, people forget, don't they, that plastic use has developed for a good reason.
Yeah, I think this is where we take a good look at where these materials are ending in our system. Outright reduction is obviously preferable, but where are we moving from plastic that's recyclable to plastic that's unrecyclable and ends in a landfill? Where are we moving from a single-use package to a possibly reusable package? Is glass preferable for reuse than plastic? Most likely, yes. I think Erin can probably talk to the science behind that more, but that's where we look at when we're implementing the treaty, what systems are we operating in and what systems are we building? Are we making sure that the things that we produce can actually be reused, recycled over and over and over again to achieve that maximum environmental value? So I don't know that the treaty will incentivize a transition to other materials in the way that we might be expecting. I know on the legislative level, sometimes we do see that trade-off where there are external incentives that weren't anticipated in the drafting of legislation when it comes to lightweighting or the outright elimination of materials. Sometimes those are automatically substituted with something that might be environmentally less preferable. But I think the way this treaty is designed is to be really thoughtful about the systems in which the products and packaging are operating, which is, of course, different. It's different across the United States. It's different across the world. We have different capacities and different systems and different collection methods. But I think the treaty will do a good job of understanding how and why we create materials and where they end. Jody, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that, Anthony, because I think a lot of this is out of scope of the treaty. We have a couple big topics on the table that require hours and hours of conversation with over 200 parties. If you include some of the key stakeholders who've been providing technical support and the governments as well as the intergovernmental organizations. So I see choices around material being ultimately driven by the national legislation that will follow the treaty. This isn't a topic that will be in the treaty. And in the chat, there have been a number of questions around, will specific technologies or options be at play? They're probably not going to be addressed because the idea is that the treaty is a fairly high level text that reflects what individual member states or countries cannot address alone. That's the fundamental nature of a treaty, is collectively working on transnational issues, transboundary issues. And I think we're going to see a lot of the decision-making impacted by the national legislation and also by trade policy, because ultimately a legally binding treaty doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. It's based on the members to implement, but the trade system could have mechanisms through regional or bilateral trade.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move on to another question now. And it's one of the age-old questions: who pays? Questions asked. Has been discussions on the financial aspect of all of this, and what's the perspective of the business coalition, and how finance should be provided. Erin, do you want to have a crack at that one?
Yeah, I'll start with the discussions on who pays and how the financial instrument, right? So every MEA or multilateral environmental agreement has a financial instrument, because as we know, those economies that can't afford it need help being successful. I think Jody spoke to the importance of some of those communities really having the moral high ground. Well, they are, one of the barriers to them being a part of it is that they are worried that they aren't going to be able to afford the financial investment it will take to deliver on it. And not just the financial investment, the capacity building, right? The knowledge transfer, all of those things. And how do they make what works someplace else work in their place, which might be a small island. So what was discussed right now is there's sort of, I think, the idea of what was called a polluter tax. I think it is now being referred to as a maker fee, because some did not love that it was called a polluter's tax. And that was interesting because people were realizing that like a fee like that would not be able to be funded into a global institution and then dispersed, right? So but they are still trying to figure out, is there a way for the makers of plastic to help pay for the issue itself? There is then the financial mechanism is usually the global north or the large economies pooling funding in either an existing development bank or Jeff, or creating their own system or creating a blended model. All of that has implications, obviously. And so those different options are a part of what's being discussed, along with, is there an opportunity to pull in this maker's fee? Again, that's a bit of the intersessional work. This is something that everybody agrees needs to happen. It's just about getting through the politics to figure out how to make it happen. But it is really, it's a key form. I think this is a lot about infrastructure and transition funding, right? Thinking about how countries transition. The other part of this, right, is the operating budget that comes from EPR systems, which is often paid by businesses, right? So this is a country financial instrument, so it will be paid by countries. And so even if there is a polluter fee or a maker fee, it would be paid through the countries most likely. But for the EPR would be something that would be, how do we sustain? And that's how you build in that fee modulation through an EPR system. So there's a lot of different discussions and of course, different avenues for getting there that are on the table.
Thank you. Anthony, do you want to comment a little bit on, in terms of policy perspective, the kind of who pays in a situation?
Yeah, from an extended producer responsibility perspective, it is the brands who pay for the packaging they put on the market, and they're incentivized to either reduce that packaging, create reusable options, or create formats that are easily recycled in their local geographies. It's important then that that funding is used only to operate and invest in the system, whether that's a reuse system, a recycling system, not necessarily incentivizing landfilling, but it's important that those producers have that payment, that fee, and then have control over how that fee is invested. And that incentivizes the producers to internalize the cost of their packaging. Right now, when packaging is put on the market in places without EPR, producers produce it. It's then up to the consumer and the local government to handle that packaging, whether it's recycling or landfilling. And it's often quite expensive. But extended producer responsibility works to internalize those costs and give producers responsibility over the system So they're using less and using what they do use more responsibly. So at a national and at a local level, I think it's up to the producers to build and fund that system.
And Jody, feel free to build on what I say, but just want to make it clear that this is something that business is advocating for, progressive businesses are advocating for. We want effective EPR. We recognize our obligation to pay a fee, and that fee goes back into building systems. So we have that shared aspiration to fund the transition to circularity. And Jody, I don't know if there's anything specific from Nestle you want to add.
Well, I'll just add our perspective as we operate at Nestle in 188 countries, and there are currently 79 different national EPR systems in place, a number of state or provincial level ones, and 35 draft laws for new national systems. So it's more than half of UN member states, but there are tremendous differences between the systems. And so in the Business Coalition, we've put forward a policy paper you can see on our Business Coalition for the Plastics Treaty website. You can see our position on EPR and some of the models and examples that we reference, as well as some best practices and recommendations for the treaty text. We've been getting involved in this way because we want to highlight the work that we've done already on a voluntary basis and some of our learnings from EPR systems that work well versus others that don't deliver on the objectives to ensure collection, processing, and ultimately recycling of material.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of our time. I'll ask one final question to all of the panel, and it's this one. It's a great question from Louise Edge. If you had to make a bet right now, would you say that the treaty will be resolved in Busan, which is the next round of talks, or will the process be extended? Anthony, so very, very quickly, if you would, yes or no, and why?
So I'm not going to answer yes or no. I'm going to say I'm not sure. So I'll leave that to Jody or Erin, who are the true international law experts. But I will say I hope so. I really hope that we recognize the urgency of the moment, finish a treaty in Busan in 2020 at the end of 2024, and move toward ratification and implementation in 2025, because this is an urgent issue that needs to be addressed as soon as possible. So I won't answer your question, but I will say my personal hope is yes.
That's quite a long non-answer. Thank you.
Yeah,
Patrick.
Percentage probability is, I think there's, and it's not directly answering the question, I think there's really strong incentive to get it done this year. A, because it's an urgent issue. We need to tackle this as quickly as possible. B, because of significant change in administrations globally. I think that also builds that sense of pressure to get this done by INC-4.
Okay, Jody.
I would say yes, I expect it to get done in Busan, but I think we're going to see a lot of intersessional work and maybe even additional sessions inserted as the idea has been floated. And lastly, if I may make a pitch, Ian, if you're a business on the call right now and you want to see the treaty move forward and you want to work with other like-minded businesses, check out the Business Coalition and consider joining us, because we're going to be working on this all through the summer and the fall, as well as probably into next year.
And that's the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty, isn't it?
Yes. Thank you for indulging me, Ian.
No, absolutely. Erin.
I will always say yes. I think primarily because we need to believe it's possible. That's part of this process. It's really funny in the way it is. It's not being naive. It's what's needed and necessary, as Anthony said. But it's also that pressure is there. I think, like Jody said, we're going to get a treaty at the end of this year. I think it's going to be one that's going to need to be strengthened. So the work is not going to be done. The work will need to continue in the Conference of Parties to strengthen it. The work will need to continue really in the national action plans and the work that happens to deliver on that. So the work that companies are doing, the work like organizations like the Recycling Partnership are going to be doing, that's just going to be the essential backbone of the success of all of the countries delivering on that. So, I mean, the fact that we are having this conversation and there's this many people on, and then there'll be that more of these conversations in different spaces, is because there's going to be a treaty. It's going to change things, and we all need to figure out how to be a part of that. So, yeah, I think I'm going to bet strong on yes.
So it's definitely two kind of sort of on the fence, but no, thank you very much. That's a nice positive note on which to end. We're out of time. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thanks to all our panelists for their insights, and thanks also to you all for all your questions. It's been really interesting. Thank you very much indeed. And now the issues that we've been discussing today will be part of the conversations at the upcoming Sustainable Packaging Innovation Forum. We'll be in Philadelphia in the US, a new venue for us, on the 29th and 30th of October. So full details will go live on the Innovation Forum website in the next few days. So do keep an eye out for them and let us know if would like some more information. We'll be in touch with the audio and video recordings of the webinar in due course, so you can watch them again and share with your colleagues. But for now, though, thank you for joining us and goodbye.